Hey, what's going on YouTube? Today I'm going to be going over my cold flask of acid miner trapper, whatever you want to call it, build, and kind of just how it works and how this build is was kind of formulated and the idea behind it and stuff like that. So for the past few weeks now, I've been playing the gel cores detonating arrow trapper build, and I was a big fan of the trapper skill in general, but I noticed something about explosive trap that was always piquing my interest, and it was this node right here, Instrument of the Alchemist, which basically does the same thing as detonating arrow, but it does it with acid flasks. And I figured, why don't we try to make something with that? So I did, and this is what we ended up with. The video you just saw before this was 1130 corruption. I'll show you again. Here it is, 1130 corruption. So you can see the node is now complete that I had clicked. So it is legitimately clearing 1100 corruption, which is cool. It could probably get further. What I think this build has an edge on against the other gel cores build is the fact that it freezes everything. And because it's able to freeze everything, it's got this like secret defensive layer to it that makes it so that it just basically doesn't get hit. That means that it probably is also very, very good for arena, although I have not tested this because endless arena does take a long time. I just haven't had the time yet to do it, but something tells me this could get pretty far in arena as well. And the best part about this build is, besides the obvious rings and gloves, the rest of the build is really honestly quite cheap. I'm gonna go over the gear at the end and kind of the budgetized idea of it and how you can like try to budget it a little bit better. But I want to start by going over the skills and exactly how the build functions. So the way the build works is we are reducing the mana cost of explosive trap as much as possible, and then we're making it so that traps throw additional traps through trap sprinkler. And then those traps also throw more traps, and then those traps throw traps, and then, you know, basically you get like 100 million traps, and then they all throw acid flasks. And then with Vial of Volatile Ice, we are converting the acid flask to a cold flask, which is allowing us to freeze enemies with the cold flask. And then we are getting all of this elemental shred. We're getting cold and lightning and fire shred. And then we're getting a lot of elemental pen with our explosive trap. And then we're also firing detonating arrow. Now, the detonating arrow tree looks a lot different than the gel cores build because it is not focused around having detonating arrow deal any amount of damage. It really can't deal damage with the setup. So I have shifted it around to make it so that it can do damage over time or just be a support for acid flask. Now, I do find that detonating arrow is still like very, very good to be used here because of how impactful it is at long distance freezing, as well as its capability of applying Frostbite against bosses. Because without it, and I did test this, without detonating arrow, the Frostbite stacks you could cap out around was 700. With detonating arrow, you're capping out over 999, pretty much no problem. So for the detonating arrow, basically what we're doing is we're forcing it to detonate instantly, but we're giving it a cone area, so it will freeze not only the enemy it first connects with, but everything behind it as well. We're also making it so that detonating arrow has no mana cost using mana arrow. This is allowing us to fire off detonating arrow through mines without losing any mana. Otherwise, without this node, the build would not work. You would constantly run out of mana. Besides that, we're just getting the Elipen nodes down here because they're very powerful, and then we're just getting Frostfang arrow to convert this to cold, and then we're getting Frozen Resonance. Since we are already stacking cold res, we are just getting a ton of added freeze rate multiplier through this node. This node's giving me like close to 2,000 freeze rate multiplier alone. And then we are just getting deadly ailments so that detonating arrows, frostbites that it applies, deal more damage over time. Mainly just for lack of a better option, and that's about it for detonating arrow. So detonating arrow generally is just applying a debuff to enemies of minus LE res, and then also applying a ton of extra freeze to help us freeze enemies more consistently. We then have Acid Flask, and Acid Flask's entire goal is to apply as much poison as possible so that we can apply as much Frostbite as possible, as well as increasing the damage a little bit and getting some extra buffs. So we get Corrosive for extra damage, we get Armor Shred from Tempered Glass, we get Poison Pools, which turn into Cold Pools. And because we are triggering Acid Flask, there is no cooldown to Acid Flask. So even though it says it's got a 2-second cooldown, when we are triggering it off of mines, it will not, it'll bypass the cooldown. So you don't have to worry about that. So we're taking Poison Pools, and then we're taking Amatoxic Pools, which is allowing us to get Efficacious Toxin on enemies, which is granting us more damage over time. And then we are getting higher global poison chance if they're standing in a pool, which is just giving us more Frostbite chance. And then, of course, we're taking just 100% poison chance, which then, again, gets converted to Frostbite chance. Everything else in this tree is, for lack of a better word, useless, except for maybe Splash Zone. And you could get up to this Frailty chance, but it's not worth the 4 points you have to put in to get there. So generally, this is the tree that you come up with for Acid Flask. Nothing spectacular, but it does the job. For Shift, we're just taking our mana efficiency nodes and cooldown reduction nodes, as well as the haste nodes, and then we're taking Shadow Slip and Elusive just so that we can get over to Parting Gift and Arrival Gift. And this is just allowing us to throw flasks on Departure and Arrival of Shift. So if I show you, if I use Shift, you can see I cast a flask at my arrival and departure location. This helps freeze enemies if I'm dashing into a pack or something, and I haven't got my traps to go off yet. It's a good way of getting that done. So, and then you'll notice it drops a Shadow Clone as well. Honestly, the Shadow Clone isn't really doing anything. I just don't know where else to put this point for Shift. Maybe you could find a better place for it. Maybe Unseen Strike could be better, or I don't know. Emergency Flask is not good because if we use, as you can see, if we use flasks, we do heal, in which just drops our ward. So it's like not actually that good. We don't really want that. So I guess it's either like you could do one of three things. It's either like Unseen Strike, Deadly Ambush, or Lasting Presence, right? I chose Lasting Presence. Both of these are great options as well. And then the bleed chance is like pretty pointless to take, in my opinion. So you'd have to be your own judge. Unseen Strike might be better, something to consider. And then for the Smoke Bomb, nothing new here. This is pretty much the same tree as the Gel Cores tree. We are just getting extra throwing damage, extra duration, Concealed and Carnage, and then we're getting Ailment Cleanse and Silver Shroud stacks. And then, of course, we're getting Dusk Shroud while we're standing in it, and Glancing Blow chance. So it's just a good defensive tool. We just cast it so that we can be protective and we get a little bit of bonus damage. And then for the passive tree, again, this is very similar to the Gel Cores build with a few extra changes. I just noticed there's something wrong with the passive tree. I will be right back. So the old version of this build was using Gel Cores Blasting Knife. So we were using a dagger, which made sense as to why the passive tree had dagger nodes. But we have since changed to Frozen Ire, and therefore some of the passive nodes have changed, but now I can go over the passive tree. So the passive tree, the issue with the passive tree is it doesn't really support this playstyle, so you have to get creative with the nodes you're picking here. And so we're going for mainly like throwing attack speed and dexterity and health and dodge rating, right? And then glancing blow, of course. So here, as you can see, we're getting dodge rating, poison res, damage taken while moving, minus 20%, increased dodge rating, haste on hit chance, dex and health, throwing attack speed. That's mainly what Swift Assassin is. And then dodge and parry and thief guard. So we're getting extra glancing blow and dodge, and then extra HP. Here in the marksman tree, we're just taking focus fire for the extra dodge rating debuff, and which actually does matter because if things are dodging our attacks, they are not getting frozen. So we want to make sure they are still getting frozen. And then, of course, extra dex equals extra damage and dodge rating. So good for us. In the Falconer tree, we're just taking Wilderness Scout for the extra health and dodge rating. We're taking increased dodge rating and mana regen. And then we're taking Raptor's Wings for a chance to gain haste when your Falcon hits an enemy, which doesn't matter, but you do deal more damage while you have haste, and we have haste all the time, so we are just kind of getting a 5% more damage multiplier, again, for lack of a better option. And then Peltast, which is just increased throwing attack damage and again increased throwing attack speed, which is useful. And then over in Blade Dancer, we're getting our glancing blow chance up and dex, as well as getting a chance to gain Dusk Shroud when we're hit with some extra health. And then Blood Serpent's Blades, which since we don't have a dagger, we're not getting the extra poison chance, but we are getting a global damage over time increase of 50%. And then we are getting throwing attack damage, melee attack damage, and movement speed from Pursuit. And then we take a point into Flow and Rhythm just for the extra throwing attack speed buff for 2 points. It's pretty cheap and easy to achieve. So what you're left with is pretty good throwing attack speed. And you're not seeing the flasks here because there's no enemies for the traps to jump to. But as you can see, obviously your mana is going to go down. So you do have to keep track of that. But when you use shift, your mana goes basically back to full. So you just need to make sure that you're shifting consistently so that you can stay above mana, and that'll keep everything in order. Smoke Bomb you really only need to use for bosses, or if you take a nasty damage over time or debuff, you can cleanse it. And that's about all you're using Smoke Bomb for. And then Decoy, of course, is just like a distraction tool. It's generally, you don't even really need to use it. It's just there to trigger flow if you ever want to use flow, and also to distract enemies. But that's about it. Now moving on to the gear, which is the really interesting part, because this whole build works around based off of some of the gear. So Acid Flask has a mana cost of 10 off the base, okay? So we need to have -10 to throwing attack mana cost, otherwise the build doesn't work. Can't be -9, can't be -8, has to be -10, which means you need tier 7 throwing attack mana cost rings, which is expensive on a 1LP Ocarian, which again, the Ocarians are expensive, but honestly the main cost here is the throwing attack mana cost mod. That mod right now is going for something like 90 million gold a piece. Of course, you can't use Rune of Creation to split it to try twice, but this will be the expensive part. And then the second most expensive part, which is Frostbite Shackles with Low Life mod. The Low Life mod tier 7 is like 400 million gold, but if you go for tier 6, I think it's only 10 million. And then the Shackles itself for 1LP is only 2 million gold. So there is a budget option of going for lower Low Life. And as you can see in my monolith, my resting ward is only 2,700, but my ward will go all the way up to 10, 11,000, sometimes even up to 15,000, just because of my ward retention and the fact that I can gain ward on freeze. So the ward gain on freeze, you want to make sure when you're buying Frostbite Shackles that your ward gain on freeze roll is as high as possible. That is going to be a large amount of your defenses for ward generation. So do make sure that you are getting that roll pretty high when getting these gloves. The Low Life mod is just for resting ward. It's honestly not doing much besides that. And you could even replace this with the hybrid freeze rate and cold res mod. And that might honestly be better. I haven't tested it, but it might be better to do that. Now, the whole way the build deals damage is through Snowdrift. Snowdrift has 2% cold pen with frostbite per 10% freeze rate multiplier. So we are stacking freeze rate multiplier all over this build to get as much cold pen as possible. And that way, when we apply frostbite, we get those big, chunky damage over time hits. So Snowdrift is a core piece of the build. The 2LP that you could use is move speed and cold res. You could also go for like cold res and dex, cold res vitality, cold res necro res. Those will work. Even cold res fizz res, because this build does lack a little bit of fizz res, but I really like the movement speed. Being able to run fast through my monoliths, it makes it feel comfortable. So you can see this build does run quite quickly. You can see it's 70% move speed at base, and after a dash you get for 1.5 seconds 120% move speed. So Very fast build. We're then using Ukanui Sphere. Now, the thing about Ukanui Sphere is you have to align your int and attunement. So I'm going to go over how we're pulling that off when we get there. But Ukanui Sphere is going to basically just give us a flat 360% increased cold damage, along with some extra cold and lightning res, which is going to give us more ward retention. And then we just tag on freeze rate multi and cold res in the LP slam. Ukanui Sphere is, as far as I could tell, the best relic option. I couldn't really find anything else that came close to what Ukanuis can do, so this felt correct, at least for me. Of course, we're running Ocarians. Like I said before, freeze rate per stack of chill is very, very strong. The max amount of chill stacks you can apply is 3 on an enemy, so basically just take that number. If you ever see freeze rate per stack of chill, multiply that number by 3. That's how much freeze rate you're getting off of it. Not only that, but it's allowing us to shock enemies and giving us just literally 10% flat added more damage, because we are always going to be at max shock, which is 10 stacks. And then we have 2 of them. So we're getting a flat 20% more damage. We're getting a ton of freeze rate. It is definitely the best ring option. Now we're running Viper Tail. This is a belt that most people look at and laugh at. Nobody sees it as being useful, but I have found a way to make it useful. And that is because it has chance to poison on hit and increased dodge rating, which is great for our build because our build is a dodge build and it is a poison build, kind of. Since we're converting all of our global poison hit into frostbite chance, it is basically saying 66% chance to frostbite on hit with acid flask. And then we are, because Viper Tail is so cheap, a 3LP Viper Tail is literally 50,000 gold on the market. You can get the best mods on it. So I get tier 7 freeze rate with increased mana regen and cold res. That feels really comfortable for me. I think besides this, you could swap mana regen for necro res, or mana regen for cold damage, or even mana regen for increased elemental damage over time. So those are your options. But freeze rate multi feels really important, and cold res, of course, you need for the ward retention from Frostbite Shackles. For the weapon, we're using Frozen Ire. Frozen Ire is insane with Bone Clamor in particular, but it's also just insane because of how much freeze rate it provides. So not only does it allow us to LP slam on freeze rate multiplier, but it has freeze rate multiplier based on it, a total of 284% freeze rate on it, and then gives us spell cold damage, which doesn't do anything because we aren't casting spells, but then we also just get an increased flat cold damage. And then we're adding chance to poison on hit. Best in slot here is extra cold pen instead of chance to poison on hit, but chance to poison on hit will do because it just applies more frostbite stacks. You want to go for minion and player cold pen suffix if you can, or increased damage over time, or increased cold damage. But you definitely want freeze rate multiplier tier 7 on there. And 2LP Frozen Ires are about 1 million gold. And then we have Eliko's Abandon. Eliko's Abandon, we only need +1 to throwing attacks, so you can get a mineral on the plus to throwing attacks. And then you want to focus probably on the resistance roll, which is the best. If you need to focus on a roll here, I would focus on the resistance roll on the chest piece. And then this is providing us increased dodge rating, increased damage over time. It's giving us a little bit of armor. And then it's a very common chest piece as well. And it's giving us some increased AoE. It's basically doing everything we want it to. The throwing an acid flask consumes a potion in order to throw an additional flask that deals extra damage. That won't happen. That doesn't happen on this build because we aren't hard casting acid flask. So you don't have to worry about that mod. That mod will not burn through your flasks. But these again are pretty cheap. I think it's like 25 million for a 3LP, and then if you go 2LP, they're basically free on the market. So the most important rolls here are Ellie Res and Necro Res. For the prefix, you actually would probably want Dexterity instead of Vitality, I'd say, or maybe increased Armor Shred effect, but that's about all I can think of. But mainly you just want the tier 7 Ellie Res with tier 5 Necro Res. And we're doing Ellie Res here so that we can cap on our fire resistance and our and our lightning resistance. So we do need one spot of Ellie res, so I put it in the chest piece because it has the highest value roll. And then we move on to Vial of Volatile Ice. For this, the main things you want on this is freeze rate multiplier and increased cold damage. I got crit chance. I don't want that, but that is a tier 6 ward per second on there as well. So I am keeping it for the time being, but mainly you want like freeze rate, cold res, cold damage, I think is the best. And then otherwise you can go like freeze rate, cold damage, necro res, freeze rate, cold damage, Ellie res, freeze rate, cold damage, fizz res, freeze rate, cold damage, ward per second. One of those. But the cool thing about this offhand catalyst is it's like 50, again, another one of those 50,000 gold for a 3LP. It's really cheap, really common. So you can basically put an entire exalted item onto this catalyst. The downside is it gives us intelligence, right? So we have to align our attunement with our intelligence. So with the Bone Clamor, we are also getting intelligence. So we're looking for actually a minimum roll Bone Clamor. We want 6 int on the Bone Clamor so that we don't have to meet such a high requirement on the intelligence. So here you can see I have one base attribute of intelligence, and then I get the 6 from Bone Clamor. That brings me to 7, and then 4 from Volatile Ice. And then I have the 1 from base attunement plus the 10 attunement that is going to align me here. So you have to get attunement in your Bone Clamor so that you can align your attunement with your intelligence. And then the second mod can be, cold res, necro res, what have you. Honestly, probably just cold res is the best, but you definitely need the attunement there to cover your bases for Ukanui Sphere. And then last but not least, we are using Frozen Eyes of Formosus. You just want the hybrid freeze rate multi and cold res here. I have increased damage over time, but that increased damage over time could also be like necrotic res. It could be increased cold damage. It could be cold pen. There's a million different options. But the main two you want is the cold res and the freeze rate multiplier. And again, we are running Frozen Eyes because of the freeze rate per stack of chill. It's just a ton of extra freeze rate. And these, again, for 3LP, I think is like 3 million gold at the time of recording. So again, very cheap for a 3LP, or you could even go 2LP. Like I said, the increased damage over time isn't very needed, so you can get away with 2LP. For the blessings, I have freeze rate multiplier, chance to apply Frostbite on hit, a chance to apply Frailty, extra all res, and void res, so that we can cover our void res, get an extra res for cold res increase, as well as covering things like our fizz res, which is already lacking. And then, of course, we want freeze rate multi and frostbite chance. These are literally perfect for our build. And then frailty is giving us basically 18% damage reduction. So pretty solid. It's definitely better than the armor node. The armor node would get us to 20% armor, so it would be a 4% damage reduction. Frailty is giving us ultimately 18% damage reduction, so technically better in that sense. For the idols, we're just going freeze rate multiplier and cold res on all of these stout idols. And then for the huge shadow idol, we are taking chance to summon a bee with acid flask and Ellie res. We're getting summon a bee. The only reason we're using it is for a distraction tool. It's allowing for enemies to not get in the way. If a straggler somehow doesn't get frozen, it might try to attack a bee instead of you. So, or a bee will try to distract it in some way. So bees are great for keeping things away, and that's why we're running this. But if you think the bees are a meme, that you can just replace this with 2 more of these stout freeze rate multiplier and cold res idols, and you'll do fine. And then we have increased damage over time and fizz res on our small idols here in order to help cover that fizz res deficit and give us a little bit of extra damage over time. And that's the build, guys. Hopefully this was insightful and a different way to play the game for trappers, because I know the Jail Core's Blast Mine build has been all over the place. Now, this build isn't as offensively powerful as the Jail Core's build, but I do think defensively it has legs to stand on. The fact that it can get up to 13, 14k ward and can freeze everything means that it's pretty solid defensively. I'd say the bossing is a little lacking in this build. The bossing is quite slow, so but you do freeze the boss unless you're fighting the Age of Winter boss, in which case it's just Age of Winter boss is a bit of a nightmare to fight. So if you plan on farming Age of Winter, don't make this build, but maybe I'll come up with a bossing setup sometime down the line. But this is mainly an echo setup currently. It can do bossing. It can kill tier 4 Julra just fine. It can kill bosses up to 700 corruption just fine. After about 700 corruption, it starts to get quite slow. So you'll have to roll with the punches. Hopefully I can come up with something for bossing. But yeah, I will let you guys know what I come up with. Or if I come up with anything, I'll leave it in the description. All right, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my stream. I stream here on YouTube and at twitch.tv/bikespokes. Monday through Thursday, sometimes Friday. And we'll see you in the next one. All right, take care.